Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little more toothy and not in a good way. Imagine for a second that you have a toothache, not the dull kind you ignore with ibuprofen, the kind that sends lightning bolts through your jaw, makes your eyeball throb, and turns every sip of water into a gamble with screaming. Now imagine your treatment options. You can pray. You can drink enough ale to forget your own name. Or you can visit the local blacksmith, the same guy who shoes horses and pulls nails from rotten wood, and let him shove a pair of rusted iron pliers into your mouth while his apprentice holds your head still. There is no Novocaine. There is no chair that reclines. There is just you, a leather strap to bite, and the hope that he yanks fast. This was medieval dentistry, and if you think going to the dentist sucked back then, wait until you hear what it was like to be the dentist. I'm talking about the man who had to reach into those screaming mouths, day after day, breathing through every cloud of rot, watching patients bite through their own tongues, and eventually, inevitably, feeling that same decay creep into his own teeth. Why did he do it? How did he learn? And what happened when the tooth puller ran out of teeth to pull? If you're brave enough to find out, hit subscribe and tap the bell, because tonight we're opening wide, and trust me, you're going to want to look away. There was no application process, no dental school acceptance letter, no moment where you sat across from a mentor and declared your intention to spend your life wrist deep in other people's agony. You became a medieval dentist the same way you became most things in the Middle Ages, through accident, through desperation, or through the quiet realization that you were the only person in the room who didn't look away. Maybe it started in childhood. You were born into a world where teeth were temporary and pain was permanent. You watched your own father chew on the side of his mouth for years because the other side had gone black and angry. You watched your mother tie a cloth around her jaw and weep into her lap while the neighbor's wife burned herbs and whispered prayers that didn't work. You watched grown men walk around with gaps in their smiles, like missing teeth were just another part of being alive, like the rot was simply what happened to people who weren't lucky enough to die young. And then one day, someone came to town, a traveler, a barber surgeon with a cart full of rust and a reputation that preceded him like a smell. He set up near the market, and within an hour, there was a line. Not a line of eager patients, a line of desperate ones. Men with faces swollen beyond recognition. Women who hadn't slept in weeks. A boy your age, clutching his jaw, tears carving paths through the dirt on his cheeks. You watched because everyone watched. The barber surgeon didn't work in secret. He worked in the open, on a stool, with an audience. He wanted witnesses. Witnesses spread word. Witnesses became future customers. The first pull was fast. Too fast. The pliers went in. The patient screamed. The tooth came out in a spray of blood that caught the sunlight like something sacred. The patient slumped. The barber surgeon held up the tooth, black, cracked, glistening, and the crowd gasped like they'd just seen a miracle. The patient was still bleeding, still whimpering, still clutching his face like it might fall off. But the tooth was out. The pain was gone. And everyone in that crowd believed they'd just watched magic. You believed it too. The barber surgeon caught you staring. Noticed that you hadn't flinched when the blood hit the ground. Noticed that your eyes stayed on the wound instead of wandering to the screaming. He crooked a finger, and you came closer because in the Middle Ages, when a man with pliers and a reputation beckons, you go. He handed you a rag, told you to wipe the patient's chin, told you to hold the bucket, told you to watch and learn and keep your mouth shut unless you wanted to be the next one in the chair. That was it. No oath, no contract, no discussion of wages or hours or future prospects. Just a rag, a bucket, and a front row seat to human suffering. You became his assistant because you were there, because you didn't run, because when the next patient arrived, a farmer with an abscess the size of a plum, you held his head steady while the barber surgeon went to work. You felt the farmer's body tense, felt the scream vibrate through his skull and into your palms, felt the hot spray of blood across your forearms, and you didn't let go. That was the test. Not skill, not knowledge, not steady hands or a gentle touch. The test was whether you could hold on while someone else fell apart, whether you could stay present in the middle of someone else's worst moment, whether you could look at an open mouth full of ruin and see not horror, but work. You passed. By the end of that first week, you'd held down a dozen screaming villagers. You'd fetched water that was never quite clean enough. You'd watched a man lose 3 teeth and thank the barber surgeon through a mouthful of blood. You'd learned that gratitude and terror looked the same when filtered through tears. And you'd stopped flinching at the sounds, the wet crack of a tooth surrendering, the wetter gasp of relief that followed, the wet thud of another root dropping into the bucket. By the end of that first month, you weren't just the assistant anymore. You were the apprentice, the one who sharpened the tools, the one who mixed the herbal rinses, the one who knew which patients needed a prayer before the pliers and which needed a leather strap between their teeth, the one who could look at a swollen jaw and guess, within a few degrees of certainty, whether the tooth would come out clean or shatter into pieces. You didn't choose this life. It chose you. The same way it chose every medieval dentist before you and everyone after. Through proximity, through necessity, through the simple, terrible fact that someone had to do it, and you happened to be standing closest when the calling came. But knowing how you got the job is only half the story. The other half is what they handed you when you started, the tools, the instruments, the rusted iron relics of 1,000 extractions before yours. And believe me, by the time those pliers made it into your hands, they'd already seen things that would make a modern dentist drop dead on the spot. Now let's talk about those tools, because if you're picturing a tidy leather roll with gleaming stainless steel instruments arranged by size and function, you're about to learn just how wrong a person can be. The medieval dentist's toolkit looked less like medical equipment and more like something you'd find bolted to a dungeon wall, if the dungeon was managed by someone with no budget and absolutely no standards. The pliers came first, always the pliers. They were heavy, rusted in places, smooth in others from generations of sweaty palms gripping the same iron. They weren't made for teeth. They were made for horses, for pulling nails from hooves, for bending metal too hot to touch, for yanking things that didn't want to be yanked. But they worked well enough on mouths, provided you didn't think too hard about where they'd been yesterday. The blacksmith who owned them before you used them on animals exclusively. Then he used them on people when the animals weren't enough. Then he died, and they passed to the barber surgeon, and now they're yours, inherited like a family recipe, except this one came with stains that never quite washed out. Then there was the tooth key, a twisted metal crank with a claw at the end, designed to hook onto a tooth and twist sideways until something gave. In theory, the tooth would release from the gum with a satisfying pop. In practice, the tooth usually snapped in half, leaving the root buried like a splinter you couldn't reach. You'd learn to dig for those roots with smaller tools, hooks and probes that looked like they'd been stolen from a medieval torture museum because, well, they basically had been. One was curved like a shepherd's crook, perfect for fishing fragments out of bleeding gums. Another was sharp enough to lance abscesses, which you'd do quickly because the pus that came out smelled like death and tasted like it too if you weren't careful with your aim. The gouge was your least favorite, a spoon-shaped blade with edges sharp enough to scrape rot from bone. You'd use it when a tooth was too far gone to pull, when it crumbled at the first touch of the pliers and left you staring at a hole full of black mush that used to be a molar. You'd scrape until the patient stopped screaming, or until you hit something solid, whichever came first. Sometimes you'd scrape too deep and hit nerve. That was when the screaming really started. And of course, there was the mallet. Every medieval dentist had a mallet, not because they wanted one, because sometimes the pliers weren't enough. Sometimes a tooth was so locked in place, so stubborn in its decay, that you needed to persuade it with percussive force. You'd hold a chisel against the tooth, a chisel in someone's mouth, and give it a firm tap. If your aim was true, the tooth would loosen. If your aim was off, the patient would lose a chunk of healthy tooth, or, in the worst cases, part of the jaw that held it. You learned quickly to aim carefully. You learned even quicker that sometimes careful aiming didn't matter. None of these tools were ever truly clean. You'd wipe them between patients, sure, a rag, some water, maybe wine if the patient was paying extra. But sterilization was a concept that hadn't arrived yet. Blood dried in the hinges of the pliers, pus crusted on the curves of the gouge. The tooth key had a faint brown stain near the claw that you'd stopped trying to scrub away because nothing worked. And honestly, you weren't sure you wanted to know what it was. The mallet had splinters in the handle. Splinters that had soaked up so much over the years that they'd turned dark, almost black, like they'd been dipped in something that wasn't water. Your mentor taught you to sharpen the tools yourself. A whetstone, some oil, a careful eye. Dull tools meant more twisting, more breaking, more digging for roots. Sharp tools meant faster pulls, cleaner breaks, fewer fragments left behind. But sharp tools also meant more damage when you slipped. And you would slip. Everyone slipped. The question wasn't whether you'd cut a patient's gum or stab their cheek or miss the tooth entirely and catch the soft tissue beneath. The question was how badly, how often, and whether they'd let you finish before they ran. You'd inherit more tools as you went. Some from your mentor when he retired or died. There was never a retirement party in medieval dentistry, just a sudden vacancy and a bucket of pliers left on your workbench. Some from other tooth pullers who passed through town and traded instruments for food or shelter or a place to sleep that wasn't muddy. Some you'd make yourself, bending iron over the blacksmith's fire, shaping crude approximations of the tools you'd learned on, praying they'd hold when you needed them most. By the time you'd been practicing for a decade, your toolkit was a museum of suffering. Pliers with teeth marks worn into the handles, a tooth key with a replacement claw because the original snapped off inside a merchant's mouth, a gouge you'd sharpened so many times it was half its original width, a mallet with a new handle because the old one split during a particularly difficult extraction. Split, you later realized, because you'd been gripping it too hard, because the patient had been fighting, because somewhere along the way you'd stopped noticing how much force you were using and started just reacting. Every tool in that kit had a story. Every tool had been inside mouths you'd rather forget. Every tool had tasted blood and pus and the terrified saliva of people who'd rather be anywhere else. And every tool would be used again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because in the Middle Ages, teeth didn't stop rotting just because you'd run out of clean instruments. But the tools were only half the battle. The real challenge was what waited at the other end of them. The mouths themselves, open and waiting, full of horrors you couldn't unsee. And those mouths, dear viewer, are a story for another moment. You'd think after years of this work, after hundreds of extractions and thousands of hours spent staring into open mouths, that you'd become numb to what you found in there. You'd think the human jaw could only hold so many surprises, that eventually you'd see it all and stop flinching. But the mouth, you come to learn, is an endless frontier of horror. And every patient who sits in your chair brings a new variation on suffering you didn't know existed. The first thing you notice, always, is the smell. It hits you before the patient even opens wide, before you see anything at all. It's the smell of decay so advanced that it's become something else entirely. Not just rot, but rot that's been cooking inside warm, wet darkness for months or years, marinating in saliva and the ghosts of meals long past. It's the smell of gum tissue dying slowly, of abscesses brewing beneath the surface, of nerve endings exposed to air and agony. It's the smell of a mouth that has become a grave, and every breath the patient takes wafts that grave directly into your face. Then they open, and you see. Teeth that lean at angles teeth were never meant to hold. Molars tilted sideways, digging into cheeks. Incisors pointing outward like tiny headstones. Canines that have rotated in their sockets, facing backward, grinding against tongues instead of food. You see teeth that have grown in on top of other teeth, layered like stones in a ruin, each one pressing against the next until the whole mouth is a traffic jam of enamel and nerve. You see black. So much black. Black that starts at the gum line and spreads upward like floodwaters. Black that eats through enamel like acid through cloth. Black that reaches the pulp, the living center of the tooth, and turns it to mush. You touch one of these black teeth with your probe, gently, barely pressing, and it crumbles, just falls apart like stale bread, leaving a crater where a tooth used to be. And in that crater, sometimes you see movement. The first time it happens, you convince yourself it's your imagination, a trick of the light, a shadow playing across ruined tissue. But then you look closer, and you see them, tiny, pale, writhing, maggots, feeding on the rot, feeding on the flesh, living inside someone's mouth because the decay has become its own ecosystem, complete with inhabitants that don't know they're supposed to be outside. You don't tell the patient. You never tell the patient. What would be the point? You scrape them out as best you can, pack the wound with wine-soaked linen, and pray they don't come back. They always come back. Then there are the abscesses. Sweet heaven, the abscesses. Pockets of pus that swell beneath teeth until the patient's face looks like they're storing a peach in their gum. You learn to recognize them by the way patients hold their jaws, tilted, guarded, like they're carrying something fragile that might break. You learn to palpate them gently, feeling for the soft spot where the pus has risen closest to the surface. And you learn to lance them quickly, because the pressure that builds inside an abscess is the kind of pain that makes strong men weep and pray for death. When you lance, the pus doesn't trickle, it bursts. Thick, yellow, streaked with blood, smelling of everything you've ever feared. Sometimes it shoots across the room. Sometimes it lands on your apron, your arms, your face. You wipe it away and keep working, because stopping means the patient suffers longer, and even you have limits on how much suffering you're willing to watch. The gums you see are never healthy, never pink and firm like the drawings monks make in their medical texts. They're red, swollen, bleeding at the slightest touch. They peel away from teeth like overripe fruit separating from the stem. They hide pockets of infection deeper than your probe can reach, tunnels of decay that burrow toward the jawbone itself. When those infections reach bone, you learn to recognize the smell, different from tooth rot, deeper, older, like something that's been dead much longer than it should have been. You see mouths with no teeth at all, just roots. Jagged stumps poking through gum tissue like broken fence posts in an overgrown field. Roots that have abscessed at the tip, where you can't reach. Roots that have fused to bone, become one with the jaw, so that pulling them means pulling apart the very structure of the face. You leave those roots. You tell the patient you've done all you can. You send them home with herbs and hope, knowing hope is rarely enough. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between patients, you find yourself running your tongue over your own teeth, feeling for movement, testing for pain, wondering if the rot has found you yet. Because after all these years, after all these mouths, you've learned one truth that never fades. The things you pull out of other people are already growing inside you. It's only a matter of time before you're the one in the chair, open and waiting, hoping someone's hands are steadier than yours. But before that day comes, and it will come, there are still more mouths to open, more horrors to witness. And the sounds those mouths make when the pliers go in, those sounds stay with you forever. You think the sights are bad? The smells, the rot, the maggots squirming in places maggots were never meant to be. Those things stay with you, sure. They haunt your dreams and cling to your clothes and follow you home like starving dogs. But the sounds? The sounds are worse. Because the sounds don't stop when you close your eyes. The sounds live inside your head forever. Every extraction starts with the same sound, the plea. It comes in 100 different forms, but carries the same desperate weight. Please be quick. Please be gentle. Please don't let it hurt. You nod like you mean it, like you have any control over the pain you're about to cause. And they know you're lying, but they say it anyway, because what else is there to say when you're about to let a stranger put iron in your mouth? Then the pliers go in, and the screaming starts. It never sounds the same twice. Some patients scream high and thin, like animals caught in traps, their voices climbing until they crack and fade into whimpers. Others scream low and guttural, sounds pulled from somewhere deep, sounds that seem to shake the walls and rattle the tools on your bench. Some scream words, curses, prayers, names of saints you've never heard of, names of children you'll never meet. Some scream your name, not because they know it, but because you're the one holding the pliers. You're the face of their agony, and in that moment you become every fear they've ever had made flesh. You learn to work through the screaming. You have to. If you stop every time someone cries out, you'd never finish a single extraction. So you keep twisting, keep pulling, keep your focus on the tooth while the sound washes over you like weather. But even as you work, you're cataloguing. You're learning which screams mean the tooth is moving and which mean you've hit something wrong. You're learning which screams will end quickly and which will go on and on until you're both exhausted and bleeding. The sounds of the tooth itself are worse. The wet crack when a molar surrenders, roots pulling free from the grip of bone. The dull snap when a tooth breaks in half, leaving the root behind like a promise you'll have to keep later. The grinding when you twist and the tooth doesn't move, just shifts slightly in its socket, making a sound like stones rubbing together underground. And worst of all, the silence when the tooth finally comes out. That single moment of nothing before the next sound begins. Because there's always a next sound. The gasp of relief that turns into a sob. The spitting of blood into the bucket, a wet percussive sound that marks the end of one ordeal and the beginning of recovery. The mumbled thanks from patients who can barely speak through swollen mouths, gratitude mixed with blood until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. You hear sounds outside the workshop too. The whispers follow you everywhere. That's him, the tooth man. He pulled my uncle's molar last spring. He pulled my mother's too, but she didn't make it. Infection spread to her jaw. The whispers never quite quiet when you pass, never quite become words you can confront, just sounds. Just the constant background hum of a reputation you never asked for. Children make their own sounds when they see you coming. Not screams exactly. Something smaller, more frightened. They hide behind mother's skirts and peek out at you like you're a monster from the stories, like you might reach into their mouths just for walking too close. You try to smile at them, reassure them, but your smile shows gaps they don't understand and stains they'll never forget. They run. They always run. At night, when the last patient has staggered home and the last tool has been wiped clean, you sit in the silence and listen to what's left. Your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the occasional creak of the workshop settling around you, and underneath it all, faint but present, the echoes of every scream you've ever heard, playing back like a choir you can't dismiss. You used to flinch at those echoes, used to press your hands over your ears and pray for quiet that never came. Now you've made peace with them. They're the soundtrack of your life, the proof that you exist, the evidence that you've done something even if that something was just causing pain to end pain. You listen to the screams in your memory and you recognize them now, not as accusations, but as stories, each one different. Each one someone's worst moment, entrusted to you because there was no one else. And somewhere in that chorus, you know, there's a scream that hasn't happened yet, your own, waiting its turn. Building in some tooth you haven't noticed, some root you haven't felt, some decay spreading quietly while you tend to everyone else's mouths. You'll hear it soon enough, that scream, and when you do, you'll understand everything every patient ever tried to tell you. But that understanding, like the scream itself, is still waiting in the dark. It starts the way it always starts, with a dull ache you can ignore. A throb in your back molar that comes and goes, easy to blame on fatigue, on stress, on the 1,000 other aches a lifetime of this work has carved into your body. You've felt this before. You've told 100 patients it's nothing, just sensitivity, just a passing thing. You tell yourself the same lie and keep working, because what else can you do? The teeth keep coming. The patients keep arriving. The screams keep needing someone to end them. But the ache doesn't pass. It settles in like a guest who won't leave, making itself comfortable, expanding into the spaces where you used to feel normal. By the second week, you're chewing on the other side without thinking about it. By the third, you're wincing when you drink anything cold. By the fourth, you're waking up at night with the pain sharp enough to steal your breath, sharp enough to make you press your palm against your jaw and rock in the darkness like a child. You know what it is. You've known since the first twinge. The same rot you've pulled from 1,000 mouths has found its way into your own. The decay you've scraped and gouged and cursed is growing inside you now, tunneling through enamel, reaching for nerve, doing exactly what it's always done to everyone else. And still, you don't stop working. You can't. The patients keep coming. You start hiding it the way your patients always hid it from you. You talk less. You smile less. You hold your jaw at angles that don't pull the bad tooth. You rinse with wine between patients, hoping the alcohol will numb what's coming, knowing it won't. Your apprentice notices you flinch when you lean over certain mouths, notices you've started favoring one side of your own face, but he's smart enough not to ask. Everyone in this trade carries something. He assumes yours is just heavier than usual. The pain gets worse. Of course it gets worse. Rot doesn't pause because you're busy. It doesn't wait until you have time to deal with it. It eats and eats and eats, and one morning you wake up and the whole side of your face is swollen and you can't pretend anymore. You look at your tools. The pliers you've used 10,000 times. The tooth key with its curved claw. The gouge you sharpened yourself just last week. They sit on your workbench like old friends, like familiar enemies, like witnesses to every extraction you've ever performed. And now they're waiting for you. You could ask your apprentice. He's steady enough. He's held down screaming patients for years. He could do this one thing for you, return the favor, pull the tooth that's been pulling you apart. But you see the fear in his eyes when you glance his way. You see the tremor in his hands that only you notice because only you know what to look for. You can't ask him to carry this. Not because he couldn't do it, but because if he fails, if he breaks your tooth or misses the root or leaves fragments behind, you'll never forgive him. And you'll never forgive yourself for putting him in that position. So you wait until night. Until the workshop is empty and the fire is low, and the only sound is your own heartbeat hammering in your ears. You sit in the chair. The same chair where thousands have suffered. The same chair where you've held them down and told them it would be over soon. And you open your own mouth. The pliers are cold. You've never noticed how cold they are. You position them around the bad tooth, feel them grip, feel the pressure spread through your jaw like a promise. Your hand is shaking. Your own hand. The hand that's pulled 1,000 teeth without hesitation is shaking, because this time the mouth belongs to you. You twist. The pain is beyond anything you've ever caused, beyond anything you've ever witnessed. It's not the sharp pain of extraction. It's everything at once, every scream you've ever heard compressed into a single moment and detonated inside your skull. You taste blood. You taste tears. You realize you're crying, and you don't care. The tooth doesn't move. You twist again, harder, and feel something give. Not the tooth, but your resolve. You almost stop. Almost put the pliers down and accept the rot and the fever and whatever comes after. But you've seen what comes after. You've buried too many patients who stop fighting. So you grip tighter, twist harder, and this time the tooth releases with a crack that echoes through your entire body. You fall backward out of the chair, onto the floor, bleeding into your lap, the tooth still clamped in the pliers, held above you like a trophy you never wanted. You lie there for a long time, listening to your own ragged breathing, feeling the empty space in your jaw where pain used to live. The tooth has won and lost at the same time. It's out. You're alive. But something has changed that won't change back. You lift the pliers to your face and look at what came out of you. It's just a tooth, black, cracked, ruined like all the rest. But it's yours. And in that moment, you understand every patient who ever thanked you through tears. Not because you felt their pain, but because you finally felt what comes after. The relief. The hollow. The quiet that follows the storm. You drop the tooth in the bucket with all the others. It lands with a clink that sounds exactly like every tooth before it. Because in the end, your tooth is no different. Your pain is no different. Your rot is no different. You are just another mouth, just another patient, just another scream that finally stopped. And tomorrow, when the sun rises and the patients return, you'll be back in this workshop with one fewer tooth and one more story. The pliers will be waiting. The screams will be waiting. And somewhere in the crowd of faces, another mouth is already rotting, already aching, already counting down the days until it's someone's turn in the chair. Maybe even yours again, because the teeth never stop coming. They never have, and they never will.